Mosaic is brought to you in part by these generous corporate sponsors. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpb.org/mosaic.
Welcome to Mosaic. I'm your host, Susan Schulman-Pertnoy. Mosaic is Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's weekly news magazine, exploring the most critical issues facing Jews here and around the world. And in this season, we'll be exploring those issues via Zoom as all of us cope with the effects of the pandemic. Our guest today grew up as a Jewish white girl in Woodstock, New York. But there was a secret about her life, and when that secret came out, it rocked her life and the lives of her family and friends. Today, we're speaking with Lacey Schwartz Delgado, the critically acclaimed filmmaker of Little White Lie. We'll be right back.
Celebrating together, overcoming together, making a difference together. During a year unlike any we have seen before, this Jewish community is helping thousands who are struggling to get by. The Palm Beaches is home to one of the largest and most vibrant Jewish communities in the world. And together, we have been a powerful force to help those who need it most.
Lacey, welcome to Mosaic. You are so accomplished. You're a writer, a producer, an award-winning documentarian, an advocate for social justice, plus you're a wife and a mother of 7-year-old twin boys. Oh my God, that's so impressive in and of itself. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Your story is amazing and it inspired your award-winning documentary, Little White Lie. So take us back. What was it like growing up Lacey Schwartz?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor. It's really, really nice to chat with you today. And thank you for those kind words. For me growing up, it's interesting. Obviously, hindsight, as we all say, is 2020. In a lot of ways, I grew up in a very, very much in the country with just myself and my parents and kind of who my parents were, even though it might have been a little bit different from the school I went to, was very much who I was. I grew up and both my parents were are New York Jews, were raised in Brooklyn. They met at a bungalow colony not too far away from where I grew up in Sullivan County. And they had moved back upstate before I was born. And so growing up, I grew up in very much what I consider to be a bubble with a loving, supportive family in a great area.
You grew up believing you were white, and it appears in your film that everybody around you also thought so. But looking back, do you wonder how everybody could have thought that?
It's interesting because, as I said, I grew up very much with who my family was who I was. They were a complete reflection of who I was. And so, one of the big themes I think that plays out in my own experience and my family's experience is about the incredible power of denial, about the ability to convince yourself to believe what you want to believe. One of the things is that I always grew up knowing that I looked different from my family. I had darker skin, the texture of my hair. I mean, some people had curly hair, but it wasn't like mine. And so that was always something I was conscious of, was this idea of difference. And what I also knew was that I was Jewish. And for us, being Jewish was synonymous with being white. We didn't talk about it as white, but it was something that was very much about, my great-grandparents had come from Eastern Europe through Ellis Island. I knew what my story was. I knew who I came from, and I was a reflection of these long line of other kind of Eastern European Jews. So, that's what my parents were. That's what I was. Now, when you looked at me, it didn't actually reflect it. And as I share in the film, there were lots of different moments where it was put in my face that there was something else going on. But the story that was told to me when it came up about me looking different was the idea that I had my great grandfather on my father's side was Sicilian.
So that gave you a concrete answer to where you really came from. You were, and it was on your father's side. So I'm assuming he believed that as well.
Exactly.
Yes.
Give us something to point to help us fortify the story that we were telling ourselves.
You had so many poignant moments in the film, and one of them that really struck me was when you were around 11 years old and you were writing in your diary that you wished you had lighter skin. How were you feeling then?
I mean, it's pretty incredible. When I found that, obviously I knew I had insecurities about how I looked and I remembered that, but I didn't remember writing that down. And so when I found that journal, it really struck me how deep it was, because I think a lot of those things I had pushed to the back. And I remembered the thing about my hair. I remember wishing my hair was different. I remember wishing I could do different things with my hair. But the thing about my skin, which is fundamentally something, you really can't change or not easily change. It's one thing to be able to blow dry your hair out or try to grow it out. But with your skin color, it's different. So to see that I wrote that at that young age, it honestly struck me, even in retrospect, to see how deep it had affected me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You also had a moment at your bat mitzvah when a congregant came up to you and your mother and said something about the fact that you were in Ethiopia. She was so happy to see an Ethiopian Jewish child. Do you want to discuss that?
I mean, it's interesting because, again, in retrospect, one of the things I realized is that it's all about what makes sense to us. I know for myself, when I learned that I was Black and very much still identify as being Jewish, part of me didn't really understand where I fit into the context of the Jewish people. I mean, I understood it in the sense of, or where other people of color. I had grown up, again, with being very familiar with a very specific Jewish narrative. One that was my family's, right? Exactly what I took you through before, the kind of Eastern Europe, Ellis Island, New York storyline. And so this idea that there would be Jews from other places wasn't something I was raised with. And so it's interesting to think that somebody saw me and the only context they could have, right, is to put me as an Ethiopian Jew. Because that was all they understood about any sort of idea about there being diversity within the Jewish people. And I think that really speaks to, in a lot of ways, the lack of exposure we have to otherness, even within the actual Jewish people.
Right, it's all subjective of what you're accustomed to. Most people aren't expansive. So that makes sense. Tell us what happened when you went to high school, you broadened your environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I grew up in a small town, Woodstock, New York, and very much, as I told you before, kind of in these like fairly rural areas. And Kingston, which is only 20 minutes away from where I grew up, was still much more of it's like a small city. And so there was many other different kinds of people. I mean, my elementary school, I was the only Jewish student. Pretty much everybody there was white. But when I went to high school, there were different kinds of people. And it was really the first time that I was being confronted with other kinds of people saying to me, this doesn't make sense. In my small town, it was kind of like, it felt, at least on the outside, like everybody was going along with my family's denial. But in Kingston, where people didn't know us and were just kind of looking at me like, what is the story? It was really the first time I was confronted with a lot of head-on questioning.
So that had to be quite confusing to you. How were you wrestling with your identity at that point?
It was confusing to me, but at the same time, I had growing awareness. And I think that that's one of the really important parts about denial, is this idea of a timeline of denial. A lot of times I think people look at issues, secrets, that it's going to be this big reveal. Somebody's going to find out this information. And it's like, wow, all of a sudden I know something. I think in reality, how a lot of us experience life, and in particular family secrets, is that there actually is degrees to knowing, right? So the first stage of denial was where deep down you convince yourself to believe what you want to believe, and you lie to yourself. The second stage is where deep down you know the truth, but you're not admitting it to yourself yet. And the third stage is when you've admitted the truth to yourself, but you're not talking about it with other people. A lot of times that's the stage that family secrets live in. In high school, I really was in that second stage.
On that note, we must take a break. We'll be right back after this brief message. Coming up, More of our conversation with acclaimed filmmaker Lacey Schwartz Delgado about her life and her documentary, Little White Lie.
Join adults in the Palm Beaches who are finding meaning behind the texts at the root of Judaism. Federation's Commission for Jewish Education is connecting adult learners with the life-enhancing Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning that nurtures and deepens our Jewish community worldwide. Learn more at jewishpb.org/Melton.
We're back with Lacey Schwartz Delgado. You went from identifying as a white person to identifying as a Black person. How was that transition for you? Was it a relief?
Well, it's just, to explain, as I said before, is that I had really grown up in very much this bubble. When I went to college, it was the first time that I was out on my own. And really, I felt in a lot of ways it was my first opportunity to really ask myself, who am I outside of my family? And to really be able to even explore some of these things that I had fundamentally been avoiding in a lot of ways. And so when I went away to college, I had a whole experience where I was really questioning that, but I didn't really understand, again, why I looked the way I did. After my freshman year of college, quick story of that is that I didn't check any boxes when I applied to college. And Georgetown, where I went to college, admitted me as a Black student just off of a photograph. So I had this experience really put on me of really being actually invited into the Black community. And I was very honest about not really understanding why I looked the way I did. And I got, in a lot of ways, the courage to come home at the end of my freshman year and ask my mother finally why I looked the way I did. And I think for me, at that time, the most important thing to me was just to understand myself better. It was less in that moment about, resolving things with my family. And to your question, I think I did feel relief because at that point I felt very confused that not everything was adding up. And I was very interested in just trying to understand who I was and how I could move forward. Not until what ended up being almost a decade later did I actually then kind of come home and deal with my family and really have those conversations.
So you felt the need to compartmentalize your Blackness and your Jewishness of your family, and it took you a long time to merge them? Is that what happened?
Absolutely. So what I did is I had the conversation with my mother. She told me the truth, which was that she had had an affair with a Black man who was my biological father. And at that point, I didn't talk to my father, my white Jewish father, about it. I didn't talk to anybody else in my extended family. I went on to live in what I consider to be a racial closet for the greater part of a decade. And not until I ended up making my personal documentary, Little White Lie, did I really, that as part of that process, I actually kind of went home and dealt with uncovering the family secrets to learn how to actually integrate my two identities. But to your question, absolutely, I think I lived with my identities in a sense segregated for a long time. I would go out in the world and I was identifying as Black, yes, still Jewish, but when I'd go home, I would in a lot of ways whitewash my existence and not talk about that.
That had to be so anxiety producing. I mean, is that why you felt the need to make your documentary? Is that part of the reason why you made the film?
Absolutely. I think I felt very aware that it was anxiety producing in terms of the relationships, right? When you're trying to protect secrets, living with a lot of fear of the potential of hurting other people. And so, for me, I was definitely I actually became in a lot of ways the protector of the secret. It was something that I had inherited. But at the same time, I was still really just focused on living my own life. But then I realized that it was only so far I was going to get in moving forward with my life, being able to have my own family in a healthy way, if I didn't deal with my own family secrets.
So how did your parents feel about your truthful expose?
I think first of all, you have to look at them separately. I think with my mom, again, we had many years of having these conversations together. And I think it would, when the film was finally done and it came out, she was actually proud of it. I think it really actually helped her. There was a lot of things that she was not able to do herself in terms of moving past the secrets that I think she actually ended up looking at the process as she was grateful to me for helping her move past that.
No, it sounded very cathartic for her. She emoted such raw feelings. It was really such an incredible film.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's so true. I think so often, and in certain ways, she's like, you could argue the antagonist of the film, but I think she also really represents the complexity of how hard sometimes it is to talk very honestly, even with those who are closest to us, how much fear we all have about things, how we are able to compartmentalize things in our lives. With my dad, it's more complicated, and it was more complicated. Although, what I will say, and I'm very, very much focused on always counting my blessings and my privileges. And I feel like one of my biggest blessings and privileges is coming from a loving, supportive family. And so my father supported me through this process of us, in the end, having these conversations for the first time as part of this film. He did not go through the same kind of journey of kind of working it all out that I did, but he did go through that process with me. And in a lot of ways, it strengthened our relationship and decreased the anxiety that I think had become a big part of our relationship.
Did you ever experience any anger with them or your mother because I mean, of what you had to put yourself through and the soul searching?
Absolutely. I definitely experienced anger. That being said, I would say that was not the primary experience that I allowed to lead me. A lot of it, again, was very focused on realizing at a certain point that this was my life to live, and that I had to take control of the situation, and that I could sit around and I could be the victim and I could talk about what my family should have done or could have done. But in the end, that wasn't going to help me to move forward. And so I think once I was able to articulate to myself what my goal was and what the power of the process was, that really helped me move past anger to a place of acceptance.
In the film, you talk to many of your extended family members and friends about your relationships. How's everybody today in terms of, you would confront them about the secrets?
What I can tell you is that my relationships with everyone in this film is pretty much the same and pretty strong. It's interesting. I think in a lot of ways, this is a story about me gaining racial consciousness. The aftermath is I've watched my mother gain an incredible racial consciousness. As I said before, we didn't even look at ourselves as white. We couldn't even understand ourselves in the racialized society in which we are all very much a part of. And so I think when I look at other people within my close family or close friends, I think that there are different points in that process. Some of them are, have gone through have gone through much more of a growth in terms of their own racial consciousness. And some of them, don't really engage it as much as, they might be able to.
We have to take another break. We'll be right back after this brief message. Coming up, acclaimed filmmaker Lacey Schwartz Delgado discusses her efforts to advance inclusivity throughout the Jewish community.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Smart. Please join me for Alpert Jewish Family Services No Excuse for Abuse event on February 16th, 2021 at 7 p.m. This is all about prevention of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is horrific, and there are so many people that suffer from it. It is cyclical, it keeps going, and this is our chance to try to put an end to it. So please come out and join and support us. Thank you.
We're back with Lacey. Unfortunately, denial and lies are timeless issues. You're spending a lot of your time combating denial. How can we overcome the power of denial?
It's a really interesting question. I think denial obviously functions on a lot of different levels, but the space that I really have focused a lot of work on is that very personal, intimate space. So often I think with big issues, like race, for instance, a lot of times the conversations revolve at a very top level, like society level discussion of the big problems. But actually the reality of how we experience them is at a very intimate level. within families, our closest people in our lives. So the way I look at it is, if you put all these families are really the building blocks of society. So if you put all these families together, you make communities. You put all these communities together, you make society. So rather than just focusing on, and I'm not saying that obviously societal institutional change is not important, but focusing on our own homes. This is one of the things I'll be speaking about, like our homes, our intimate spaces, and how we can actually see what we are and aren't doing, who we're inviting in, what conversations we're having, how are we welcoming or not either our own family or those closest to them into our homes.
Well, it has to start in the family, because you can't take the leap to society without getting it from here.
But it's so interesting because so often people actually do end up skipping that stage. We don't actually do the hard personal work. And I think in a lot of ways, with my personal film, that was really what I wanted people to come out of it with. I wanted them to look at that film and forget me, right? My story may be interesting, but really for the audience, I want them to come out thinking about themselves, thinking about their own families and what is the journey they need to go on, the process they need to engage in to make their families stronger and their own sense of identity, and also more inclusive in a lot of ways. I think it'll make us all feel a lot better.
You absolutely got that point across in your film. You've worked with many organizations to help them create culture of empathy and inclusion. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really comes from, from what I'm saying. It's like, I always look at everything and I have to look at myself and I have to lead by example. I have to look at the things that I need to do work in and then figure out a way that I can have that conversation to help other people do the same thing. And so it's been incredible to go into a lot of different spaces to be able to inspire that conversation. I think whether or not it's a Jewish communal space or a corporation or a school, these personal interactions we're all having and the emphasis we can come and how much we're all bringing to the table, right? When we walk into any space, we're bringing all our mishigas, right? We're bringing every piece of who we are. And we need to be able to represent those things and be able to not feel like, well, we have to compartmentalize one piece of ourselves and put it to the side.
So you're married to United States Representative Antonio Delgado, and you are raising twin 7-year-old boys. How does Judaism play a role in that, in your family?
Our lives, like many young families, has a lot of different components to it. My husband is not Jewish. He was raised Baptist, and but as I've shared before, I am very much still Jewish. We're raising our kids Jewish, but we're also raising them to understand who they are and every part of what they come from. My kids my husband is both Black and Puerto Rican. And so we are a very mixed family, and they're very close to all parts of that family. And so, for us, I think it looks like a lot of young families, and that we're figuring it out. We're looking at what our parents did and we're saying, does that work for us? And I know for myself, my grandparents, the family I came from, was such an important part of me growing up. My kids are very close to their grandparents. So we want the continuity, and at the same time, we want them to be able to engage on their own. So, the honest truth is we're still figuring it out, but we're engaging our kids in the process, and so far, so good.
We know that one of the fastest growing segments of our Jewish population here locally are young families, but they're young interfaith families. Our federation is actively working to engage them. So how do you think Jewish communities can be more accepting?
I love that. And I love hearing that. I think, it's funny because the rabbi I grew up with once said to me, when he was growing up, if somebody married somebody who wasn't Jewish, that meant that they were walking away from the faith. And he's now realized, however many decades into his rabbinical practice, that it's actually the opposite. Then a lot of times when, even in terms of, for us, that came up in terms of who was going to marry us, and who would be willing to marry us. And that when we came to him, that was because we were inviting Judaism into our family. We weren't pushing it away. And so I think that question of how can somebody like my husband, who was not raised Jewish, did not grow up with the practices, but is still open to welcoming those traditions into his life, and to, when we're sharing things with our kids, it's not just, oh, this is mommy's thing, right? It's like, how do we do it together? How do we find our way through it in the same way my parents did? And I think that's the thing we have to understand, is that different people are coming into the community with maybe different levels of exposure, different levels of knowledge, different appetites for how they want to deal with it, but that we still want to welcome them in, and understand that that is actually the reality of our Jewish community in many ways. And that's where actually our strength and our bond comes from.
That is really critical to the success of Judaism moving forward. You've been to Israel numerous times. Has there been any impact on your Jewish identity by being over there?
It's a great question. I mean, sure, I have been many times in many different contexts. And I think as many people who might be watching can agree, I mean, Israel is such an incredible country, right? So dynamic. And there's too many things to count. I mean, one of my favorite things is like the cultural engagement, obviously the food, Tel Aviv is one of my favorite cities in the world. I mean, it really, the first time I went was when I was in college, when I had friends who were studying abroad there, and I went to go visit them. And I was just really blown away at being in a place that brings so many of, the most important stories throughout so many of our religions, so many of our communities together in one place. I mean, it left me pretty awestruck. So, it's interesting in terms of, I grew up in a family that was very much focused on New York culturally, where we didn't have a very strong, connection in a lot of ways. Our Judaism wasn't about necessarily about Israel, but it was nonetheless one that was very strongly Jewish identified. And so, I will say it's interesting. In my entire family of the people I'm close with, I am the only person who's ever been to Israel. Which is pretty amazing.
That's really something.
Yeah. My grandparents never went. My mother and her sister have never gone, nor my father, nor any of my cousins. And it's so funny because I tell them all the time, like, it's I think they would absolutely love it. And so it is a special place to me. It's a complicated place, obviously, and so many different people, but I just feel like every time I go, I grow more and more.
That I feel the same way, and I have to thank you for joining us. We're out of time, but I really am so inspired by what you do in your work, and you truly live a life of making the world a better place. Thank you, Lacey.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this, and it's exciting to hear about the work you all are doing there as well.
Mosaic is brought to you in part by these generous corporate sponsors. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpb.org/mosaic.